On a porcelain plate, a pat of butter melts beside film stained dark red. On screen, critics called it truth, bold, raw, fearless. Last Tango in Paris became a monument of cinema, while Maria Schneider's tears were framed as art. She was 19. Decades later, Bernardo Bertolucci admitted on record that he and Marlon Brando withheld a crucial detail before filming the infamous scene. He stated he wanted her response as a girl, not as an actress. According to her own accounts, Schneider maintained she felt humiliated, violated, and unheard. So when the industry calls trauma art, a structural question remains. Who is protected? The woman on screen or the men behind the camera? Before the headlines, before the scandal label, Maria was a teenager carrying a private wound. Daniel Guérin was famous in France. She was his daughter outside the life he presented to the public. Accounts of her early life describe distance, silence, and delayed recognition. She reportedly did not meet him face to face until she was 16. By then, she had already learned what rejection feels like when it comes from home. A missing parent is not only an empty chair, it changes how a young person reads power, approval, and belonging. At 15, she left home. She spent long stretches in cinemas, sometimes several screenings a week. The dark room gave her order when life outside felt unstable. On screen, conflict had structure and endings. In real life, she had none. Film was not a hobby for her. It was a place where she could breathe without being judged, questioned, or corrected. That is where she built her faith in the camera, not as a threat, but as a witness. When she moved toward acting, she entered with openness and little protection. She was young, eager, and trying to prove she belonged. She did not arrive with a strong legal team, a senior advocate, or leverage. She arrived with talent and trust. In a business where status controls the room, trust without protection is risky. She thought she was stepping toward career momentum. The structure waiting for her was already uneven. In 1972, that structure had names. Bernardo Bertolucci was 31, widely praised as a major European director. Marlon Brando was 48, one of the most recognized actors in the world. On set, their authority was not symbolic. It shaped decisions, pace, and behavior around them. When men at that level agreed on a direction, others rarely challenged it. Crew members followed schedule, hierarchy, and instruction. That was standard practice in that era, especially on ambitious productions under pressure. Maria was 19. The age gap mattered, but the power gap mattered more. She had far less influence over terms, framing, and process. There was no intimacy coordinator system then, no formal boundary protocol that today many productions rely on. If a line moved during a sensitive scene, there was no neutral specialist assigned to stop and reset conditions. In that environment, silence could be mistaken for consent, and fear could be recorded as performance. The turning point began in an ordinary setting, not a dramatic confrontation. Bertolucci later said the butter idea came to him and Brando over breakfast on the day of filming. Bread, butter, a quick exchange, then a decision. He also said they chose not to tell Maria beforehand. His stated reason was direct. He wanted her reaction as a girl, not as an actress. That sentence is the core fact in this story. It describes intent, method, and hierarchy in one line. A performer can agree to a difficult scene. That is part of the profession. But informed agreement depends on exact terms. If key details are withheld in a sexualized context, the performer loses the ability to choose under clear conditions. That is not a minor communication error. It is a structural breach of trust. The process shifts from collaboration to control. When cameras rolled, the scene did not match what Maria expected. The act shown on screen was simulated, but her reported shock and emotional distress were real. In later interviews, she said she cried real tears and felt humiliated. She also said she felt betrayed by both men. She described being overwhelmed and unprepared. Those statements do not come from theory. They come from the person with the least power in the room. The camera kept recording. That detail defines the ethical failure. A director always has the power to pause and reset when a performer crosses into visible distress. In this case, the distress became part of the take. The image gained force. The person carrying that image absorbed the cost. This is how harm gets converted into prestige. The frame looks powerful, so the method is excused after the fact. After the take, Maria said Brando did not apologize. She recalled him saying, "Do not worry, it is only a movie." That line has followed the case for decades because it exposes the split at the center of film labor. For the audience, it is fiction. For the performer inside the setup, the body still registers pressure, fear, and loss of control. The set moved on. The schedule moved on. Her memory did not. When Last Tango in Paris was released, critical response centered on artistic daring. Many reviews praised intensity, realism, and boundary-breaking cinema. Festival applause was loud. Intellectual defense was immediate. The conversation was framed as art history, not labor ethics. A young actress's testimony had less weight than the mythology forming around a major director and a legendary actor. That pattern was reinforced by the culture of the time. Auteur worship gave directors broad moral cover. Risk was praised, provocation was rewarded, and methods were often protected if outcomes looked exceptional on screen. In that climate, discomfort from a young performer could be reframed as commitment to craft. Institutional prestige did the rest. Commercial systems amplified the imbalance. Publicity used scandal to attract attention. Media interviews often focused on provocation more than process. Maria was pushed into a narrow public identity tied to one scene. Meanwhile, the men at the center were discussed in language of genius, influence, and legacy. One side got authorship, the other got exposure. Financial contrast deepened the injury. Reported figures place Maria's pay at roughly $4,000, while Brando's compensation and participation terms were dramatically higher. Exact accounting varies by source, but the disparity is clear in every version. The film generated major value. The person most exposed by the production had the least protection and the smallest reward. Award season formalized the divide. The film received major Oscar nominations, including Best Actor for Brando and Best Director for Bertolucci. Institutions celebrated product quality while bypassing the production ethics question. That does not prove malice by every voter. It proves how easily acclaim can absorb unresolved harm when industry incentives align. Maria kept working, but the label built around her was hard to escape. In The Passenger, her credited role was girl. Whether by artistic choice or broader pattern, the effect fit a familiar track. She was repeatedly framed as symbol, presence, body, not fully as author of her own narrative. Over time, that reduction carries professional and personal cost. In later years, she spoke about depression, substance use, and long-term damage. She described years lost while trying to manage what happened. Her account should be read with care and respect, not as spectacle. Trauma does not stay inside one day of shooting. It spreads into work, relationships, reputation, and health. She also pushed back. During production conflicts in the mid-70s, she refused terms she found degrading and set clear boundaries. One of her most quoted lines was, "I'm an actress, not a prostitute." That was not a publicity slogan. It was a worker drawing a line in an industry that often punished women for doing exactly that. Afterward, she was frequently described as difficult. In Hollywood, that label has long been used to isolate people who refuse compliance. Away from large studio glare, she built private stability. She had a long-term partnership with Maria Pia Almadio and guarded that part of her life closely. That privacy was its own form of control after years of public overexposure. She continued acting in smaller projects and remained vocal about treatment of women in film. Maria Schneider died in Paris in February in 2011 at 58. Much of the media coverage returned to the same old frame, the scandal title, the same scene, the same shorthand. Obituaries often compressed a complex life into one public wound. Even in death, the machinery that had reduced her image kept working. Then came the delayed rupture. In 2013, at La Cinémathèque Française, Bertolucci discussed the scene again on stage. He confirmed the withholding of the butter detail and repeated his rationale about wanting a reaction from a girl, not an actress. He also said he felt guilty but did not regret it. The recording circulated more widely in 2016 and triggered global backlash. Why did the backlash land then and not earlier? Because audience standards had shifted. Public conversations about consent, workplace power, and exploitation were stronger and less deferential. People watched the clip and heard a director describe a method based on deliberate non-disclosure in a sexualized scene. The old defense language no longer held the same authority. Under pressure, Bertolucci issued clarification saying Maria knew the broader scene and not that specific detail. That clarification did not resolve the core issue, it confirmed it. Informed agreement in intimate work depends on specifics, not broad categories. Changing critical details without explicit consent is exactly where trust breaks. Since then, the film's legacy is split in two. One track still studies its cinematic impact. The other studies its production ethics as a warning case. Both are now part of the record. You cannot honestly discuss the film's power without discussing how that power was obtained. The industry also changed in concrete ways, though unevenly. In major markets, unions and professional bodies introduced protocols for intimate scenes, a clearer pre-briefing, closed-set procedures, and stronger consent practices. Intimacy coordinators became a standard in many studio and union contexts. Compliance is not universal, but the baseline expectation is no longer what it was in 1972. Criticism changed too. Strong criticism now asks two questions at once. What does the frame communicate, and how was the frame made? That is not censorship. It is literacy about labor, power, and process. A difficult film can remain in circulation while its methods are scrutinized without myth. For Maria, this recognition came late. It cannot return youth, erase pain, or rebuild a career path shaped by stigma. But it does restore factual weight to her testimony. It places her voice back into a story from which she was pushed aside for decades. The hard lesson is simple. A masterpiece is not an alibi. If a production strips agency from the least powerful person in the room to extract truth, then the finished image is not only art, it is also evidence of how power operated. The projector keeps running after the audience leaves. Last Tango in Paris remains part of cinema history, but the frame now carries a second image that does not disappear. A 19-year-old performer, a withheld detail, and a system that protected men first. So the final question is still active. When an industry calls trauma art, who is it really protecting? The answer sits in who controls risk, who signs releases, and who is allowed to stop the camera. On paper, the film industry now looks different from the world Maria Schneider walked into. Intimate scenes in major productions are often pre-planned in writing. Performers are briefed in detail. Blocking is discussed before the take. Closed set rules are common. Intimacy coordinators are increasingly standard in large studio environments. These changes did not come from goodwill alone. They came from decades of testimony, public pressure, union bargaining, and legal fear. The system learned that trust me is not a protocol, but policy on paper is not the same as safety in practice. Power still gathers fast in rooms where schedule, budget, and reputation collide. A junior actor can still feel replaceable. A director can still frame pressure as commitment. A producer can still ask for speed over caution. In those moments, the old pattern tries to return. Keep moving, get the shot, sort ethics later. Ethics. The difference now is that more workers know the pattern by name, and more of them refuse to play along in silence. This is why modern boundary work is procedural, not emotional. It cannot depend on whether a director is nice. It depends on written agreements, visible stop rules, and neutral people with authority to pause production. If the terms of a sensitive scene change, the scene stops. If a performer says no, the scene stops. If a performer freezes, the scene stops. That is not weakness. That is the baseline for professional labor. The old mythology still pushes back. You can hear it in familiar lines. Great art requires risk, discomfort proves truth, spontaneity creates magic. But risk is not distributed equally on set. Discomfort is not distributed equally on set. Spontaneity often means one person had no time to refuse. When the least powerful worker carries the full cost and the most powerful names collect the credit, it is not artistic courage. It is managerial failure dressed as vision. Maria's story keeps cutting through this debate because it exposes the exact mechanism, a hidden detail, a power gap, a camera that kept rolling, a culture that praised the result and ignored the method. That sequence still appears in classrooms, essays, retrospectives, and online debates because it forces one question no industry can evade forever. What does a masterpiece owe the person inside the frame? The fairest answer is practical, not poetic. It owes full information. It owes active consent. It owes the right to stop. It owes a workplace where fear is not mined for footage. It owes a record that does not erase the worker once the ticket sales arrive. There is also a second debt, narrative repair. For years, Maria Schneider was discussed as if one scene explained her entire existence. It did not. She worked beyond that moment. She resisted. She refused projects that demanded compliance at the cost of dignity. She built a private life away from the machine that branded her. She spoke when speaking hurt. Those are not side notes. Those are the facts that restore scale to a life reduced by scandal economics. When people say, separate the art from the artist, they often skip the worker. But this case is not only about artists, it is about labor conditions. It is about command structure. It is about what happens when one person controls meaning and another person carries the impact. If a production process violates basic workplace ethics, then historical influence does not erase that record. It sits beside it. And that is where film culture is being forced to mature. Not by banning difficult work, not by pretending transgressive cinema has no value. By requiring that difficult work be made without stripping agency from the people who make it. By treating consent as a production tool, not a public relations line. By understanding that craft gets stronger, not weaker, when workers are protected. The camera will always be able to capture pain. That is not the achievement. The achievement is creating intensity without deceit. The achievement is building scenes that are devastating on screen and ethical in process. The achievement is proving that discipline can do what coercion used to fake. So if the question is still who gets protected, the answer should no longer be decided by prestige, fear, or nostalgia. It should be decided by policy enforcement and the courage of people in the room who are willing to stop a take before harm is repackaged as brilliance. That is the line history has drawn in darker ink now, not because the industry became pure, because too many workers paid the price for its myths, and once you see that line, you cannot unsee it. That is why the future of film ethics is not decided at award shows. It is decided in pre-production rooms where contracts are drafted line by line. It is decided in casting calls where performers ask direct questions and do not get punished for asking. It is decided in rehearsals where every physical action is named before it is filmed. It is decided at the monitor when a director chooses craft over coercion. The old system treated silence as efficiency. The new standard has to treat silence as risk. If a performer goes quiet in a sensitive setup, that is not a green light. It is a warning sign. If a performer says, "I need clarification," that is not delay. That is safety protocol working as designed. If a crew member sees a boundary shift and says nothing, the failure is collective, not private. Studios now have tools they did not use in earlier decades. They have policy templates, legal language, and trained specialists. None of those tools matter unless they are backed by enforcement. A rule no one is allowed to activate is not a rule. A hotline nobody trusts is not protection. A coordinator without authority is decoration. The test is simple. When tension rises and the clock is burning money, does safety still outrank speed? This is where leadership is measured. Directors who claim moral seriousness should welcome strict boundaries, because boundaries sharpen performance. Producers who claim professional integrity should fund protection from day one, because retroactive damage control is not ethics. Stars who claim to mentor younger actors should use status to reduce pressure in the room, not increase it. Power is not neutral. It either stabilizes the set or destabilizes the weakest person on it. The archive should be read the same way. Film schools can still teach difficult scenes. Critics can still analyze historical impact. Festivals can still screen contested work. But context cannot be optional. If the process involved deception or non-transparent conditions, say it clearly. If testimony was ignored for decades, say that clearly too. The point is not to erase history. The point is to stop repeating its blind spots. Maria Schneider's name now marks a structural lesson that extends beyond one film. Young performers do not need mythology. They need terms in writing. They need the right to pause. They need witnesses with authority. They need clear language that separates performance from personal exposure. They need to know that saying no does not end a career. For viewers, responsibility is different but still real. Ask what you are rewarding when you praise intensity. Ask whose body carried the cost of that intensity. Ask whether the production treated vulnerability as collaboration or as a resource to extract. If the answer is extraction, call it what it is. Do not hide it behind prestige. The industry once relied on the idea that time would blur responsibility. It did not. Testimony stayed. Interviews resurfaced. Standards shifted. The frame remained, but the frame was no longer alone. Method entered the conversation and refused to leave. That is the turn that matters most. Not outrage as a trend, but memory with structure, policy with teeth, culture with receipts. Once those pieces lock together, reputation is no longer controlled by the loudest names in the room. So the final metric is not whether a film shocks the audience. The final metric is whether the people inside the shot were protected while that shock was made. If they were, the work can carry its weight with dignity. If they were not, the work carries evidence of a breach no award can clean. Cinema will keep chasing intensity. It should, but intensity earned through trust is stronger than intensity extracted through fear. Trust scales. Fear leaves residue, and residue lasts longer than hype. When the lights come up and the room empties, what remains is not only the image, what remains is the method that produced it, the contracts that allowed it, the witnesses who spoke or stayed silent, and the worker who had to live with the outcome after the credits ended. If the industry wants to claim progress, this is the proof it owes. Fewer myths, clearer rules, faster intervention, real consequences, better archives, and no more masterpieces built by isolating the person with the least power in the room. That is not a softer cinema. It is a more disciplined one. And discipline is what turns power from a weapon into a responsibility. Responsibility also has a legal memory. Every time a production ignores a boundary in a sensitive scene, it is not only creating moral risk, it is creating discoverable risk. Emails exist, call sheets exist, rehearsal notes exist, payment records exist. So do witness accounts. In past decades, many performers had no practical route to challenge what happened. That has changed in important areas. Labor law, union language, and digital records make denial harder when people decide to speak. But paperwork is never enough by itself. A contract can protect or trap depending on who explains it and who enforces it. Young actors still sign documents under pressure, especially when the project is high profile and the career stakes are high. Standard clause can hide wide discretion. Creative adjustments can hide last-minute escalation. Closed set can mean privacy, or it can mean isolation if no neutral authority is present. The words look similar. The power effect is different. That is why informed consent has to be operational, not ceremonial. Operational means the performer receives specific scene details in advance, in writing, with time to ask questions. Operational means choreography is concrete, not vague. Operational means every person with authority knows the stop protocol and respects it without negotiation. Operational means updates are documented before cameras roll, not after damage appears. When this process works, it does not weaken art. It removes noise. Actors can focus on performance instead of threat assessment. Crew can focus on execution instead of moral ambiguity. Directors can push emotional depth through craft tools they control: pacing, framing, sound, silence, and rhythm. Fear no longer has to be harvested from the least protected person in the room. When this process fails, the same symptoms appear quickly. Language gets fuzzy. Timelines compress. Decisions move off the record. Senior voices frame urgency as necessity. Junior voices get quiet. People say, "We'll sort it after the take." That phrase is almost always a red flag. After the take is too late for consent. History shows how expensive that failure becomes. It damages people first, then projects, then institutions. It distorts careers, forces reputational repair campaigns, and leaves archives full of unresolved contradictions. The short-term gain of one powerful scene can trigger decades of legal, ethical, and cultural cost. Studios understand this financially now, even when they struggle to admit it publicly. For performers, the practical defense is preparation and witnesses. Ask for the exact action list. Ask what can change on the day and who can authorize change. Ask how no is handled in real time. Ask who can call cut. Ask what happens if a boundary shifts mid-take. If answers are vague, the risk is not abstract. It is immediate. For crews, the practical defense is intervention culture, not heroics procedure. If protocol is broken, pause. If someone is distressed, pause. If terms change without confirmation, pause. A pause is not sabotage. A pause is how professional teams prevent escalation that later becomes scandal, litigation, and trauma. For leaders, the test is consistency under pressure. Anyone can endorse safety in press interviews. The real test comes when money is burning and a shot is behind schedule. Do you still stop? Do you still document? Do you still protect the person with the least leverage? That is where ethics stop being branding and start being governance. Maria Schneider's case remains relevant because it makes these mechanics visible. A gap in power, a hidden change, a camera that continued, a culture that rewarded outcome and muted testimony. Different era, same structural pattern that can return anywhere. Hierarchy is strong and accountability is weak. So the lesson is not trust no one. The lesson is trust systems that can be audited, not promises, procedures, not mythology, documentation, not charisma, accountability. If cinema wants to keep claiming seriousness, this is the minimum standard. No hidden changes in intimate material, no ambiguity in consent, no retaliation for refusal, and no prestige shield when rules are breached. Anything less is not artistic freedom. It is unmanaged power. And unmanaged power always finds the same target first. The person easiest to replace, easiest to silence, and hardest to defend after the footage is already sold. After that, the question becomes cultural memory. Who gets remembered as brave and who gets remembered as collateral? For decades, film history often rewarded the person who controlled the narrative first. Directors and stars had access to major interviews, festivals, studios, and critics. Young performers rarely had equivalent infrastructure. If they spoke, they were called unstable, difficult, ungrateful, or confused. Those labels worked because institutions repeated them faster than they checked them. That pattern is weaker now, but not gone. Reputation still moves through media velocity. A single framing line can travel faster than a full account. If the first headline says controversial genius, later corrections rarely catch up. If the first headline says difficult actress, people remember the adjective and forget the context. Narrative power is still a workplace issue, not only a press issue, so correction requires process at the story level too. Journalists need source hierarchy that does not automatically privilege fame. Critics need language that distinguishes artistic effect from production ethics. Festivals need contextual framing that does not treat harm as a footnote. Platforms need archival notes that stay attached to re-releases instead of disappearing after one news cycle. Education has a role here. Film students should learn not only how iconic scenes were shot, but how consent systems function and fail. They should read contracts, not only camera diagrams. They should study the economics of risk transfer, who absorbs damage, who captures upside, who controls edits, who controls publicity, who controls legal response. Craft without labor, literacy, repeats old harm with better equipment. Audience behavior matters. Viewers are not judges, but they are market signals. What they reward becomes production strategy. If audiences only reward shock, producers buy shock. If audiences reward rigor plus accountability, the market adapts. Attention is not neutral in entertainment economies. That does not mean viewers must reject all difficult cinema. It means they can ask better questions while watching it. Was this intensity built through transparent collaboration? Were the performers informed? Were boundaries negotiated and preserved? Were concerns documented? Did anyone with authority intervene when needed? These are not anti-art questions. They are pro-worker questions. The same applies to awards culture. Trophies are not legal verdicts, but they shape memory. When institutions celebrate work tied to known ethical breaches, without context, they signal that product outranks process. When they include context, they signal that excellence includes working conditions. That difference changes what future teams think they can get away with. If the industry is serious about reform, it needs retrospective accountability alongside forward policy, not only new protocols, but honest archival repair. Not only we do better now, but clear acknowledgement of where systems failed and who paid for those failures. Without that, reform sounds like branding. With it, reform becomes infrastructure. Infrastructure means boring things that save careers. Mandatory briefing templates, version-controlled scene changes, documented consent updates, empowered coordinators, non-retaliation enforcement, anonymous reporting with follow-through, and real penalties when breaches are confirmed. None of these are glamorous. All of them prevent preventable harm. This is also where intersection matters. Younger performers, women, queer performers, migrants, and workers without elite representation remain more exposed when a set drifts toward coercive improvisation. Everyone had the same chance to refuse is often false in practice. Power is uneven by design. Policy has to be built with that unevenness in mind. What happened to Maria Schneider is not only a story about one film in one decade. It is a map of how institutions can convert a person's vulnerability into an artifact. Then call the artifact history. The map stays useful because the mechanics are portable. Secrecy, hierarchy, speed, prestige, silence. The antidote is also portable: clarity, witnesses, documentation, enforceable boundaries, protected refusal. If those tools are present and active, difficult scenes can be made with integrity. If they are absent, risk migrates to the least powerful person by default. That is the pattern history keeps confirming. It is also the pattern current professionals can refuse. So when people ask whether cinema has learned, the answer is conditional. It has learned where harm comes from. It has learned how to write better rules. It has not fully learned to enforce those rules everywhere, every time, under pressure. Learning is not complete until enforcement is routine. And enforcement is not routine until the person at the bottom of the call sheet can stop the scene without losing the career. That is the benchmark. Not rhetoric, not nostalgia, not genius. Protection that still works when power is impatient. Impatience is the stress test. Every set eventually reaches a moment where schedule slips, money burns, and someone proposes a shortcut. That is where ethics either holds or fails. Shortcuts in sensitive work usually sound harmless at first. We'll keep it loose. We'll adjust on the day. Trust us. We don't need to overcomplicate this. None of those phrases are neutral when power is uneven. They move decision-making away from written agreement and back into hierarchy. Once that happens, the least powerful person carries the unknowns. Unknowns are the danger zone. If physical terms are unclear, consent is unclear. If camera coverage is unclear, exposure is unclear. If who can stop is unclear, authority is unclear. Ambiguity protects the top of the hierarchy and destabilizes everyone below it. In sensitive scenes, ambiguity is not creativity. It is unmanaged risk. Managed risk looks different. It is specific. It names what will happen, what will not happen, and what triggers a pause. It defines who is present, who is absent, and why. It logs changes in real time. It confirms understanding from each performer before every take that touches boundaries. It treats no as a valid production outcome, not a personality flaw. Teams that work this way still make intense cinema. They still reach difficult emotional terrain. The difference is where the intensity comes from, not from hidden conditions, from preparation, trust, and repeatable craft. That intensity survives scrutiny because the process survives scrutiny. This is what many people miss in public debates. Ethical structure is not the enemy of spontaneity. It is the condition that makes safe spontaneity possible. When actors know the guardrails, they can explore deeper without self-protection consuming half their focus. When guardrails vanish, exploration becomes exposure. Exposure can be monetized fast and denied later. That is the old cycle. First the footage is praised, then concerns are minimized, then years pass, then testimony resurfaces, then institutions claim surprise. The cycle repeats because production culture rewards output more consistently than it rewards prevention. Breaking that cycle requires boring discipline every day, not moral speeches after scandal. Readbacks, check-ins, recorded updates, closed set enforcement, debriefs after hard material, trauma-informed leadership on high-risk days, consequences for breaches that apply equally to stars and newcomers. Equal consequences are the hinge. If policy only constrains junior workers, it is theater. If policy applies upward, it is governance. Governance is what turns respect from a mood into a system. Systems also need memory. When a production incident occurs, lessons must be retained across studios, agencies, and training pipelines. Otherwise, each set acts as if it is the first to face the problem. It is not. The patterns are known, the failures are known, the fixes are known. What varies is will. Will is shaped by incentives. If executives are evaluated only on delivery and margin, boundary protection becomes secondary in practice. If they are evaluated on delivery, margin, and verified safety compliance, behavior changes. What gets measured gets funded. What gets funded gets normalized. Normalize the right things and culture shifts. Normalize silence and pressure. And the old pattern returns with new language. The names change. The mechanism does not. The mechanism is simple. Concentrated power plus weak oversight plus urgency equals predictable harm. The counter mechanism is just as clear. Distributed authority plus written limits plus enforcement equals durable trust. Trust is the real production asset, not hype, not shock value. Trust is what lets performers risk emotion without risking ownership of their own boundaries. Trust is what keeps crews focused on craft instead of damage control. Trust is what lets a film age without dragging a hidden wound behind it. That is why this conversation still points back to Maria Schneider. Not to freeze her in one image, but to prevent the same mechanism from finding the next person. If the industry wants fewer scandals and better work, the path is not mysterious. Remove hidden conditions, protect refusal, document changes, enforce consequences, keep context attached to legacy titles, teach labor ethics with the same seriousness as camera technique. Then the camera can keep doing what it does best, reveal truth without manufacturing harm to get it. Anything less is still the old bargain, only better branded. And better branding has never been a safety plan. Safety plans fail when they are optional. Optional safety is the same as no safety when pressure spikes. So the final stage is institutional design, not sentiment. Design determines whether good intentions survive bad days. A strong design answers 4 operational questions before production starts. Who has authority to stop a sensitive scene immediately? What exact behaviors require an automatic pause? Where updates to scene terms are recorded and approved? How retaliation is detected and penalized after refusal? If any of those answers is vague, the system is weak by definition. Weak systems create predictable loopholes. Senior talent can request small changes that are never formally logged. Producers can frame urgency as necessity and bypass process. Junior performers can be isolated through private conversations that are never documented. Coordinators can be present but sidelined. By the time concern reaches legal or HR, the footage already exists and leverage has shifted. Strong systems close those loopholes in advance. No off-record intimacy changes, no unilateral physical escalation, no closed-door renegotiation without a neutral witness, no take proceeds until updated consent is captured in writing, no adverse casting consequences for boundary refusal. These are operational guardrails, not philosophical positions. Guardrails must be audited. Audit means random review of scene documentation, not self-reporting by department heads. Audit means post-shoot performer surveys handled by independent channels. Audit means incident metrics tied to executive performance reviews. If leadership bonuses ignore safety outcomes, safety remains secondary in practice. There is also a legal clarity issue the industry still underestimates. Everyone agreed is not a defense if agreement conditions were altered under pressure or without full disclosure. Courts and arbitrators increasingly examine process integrity, not only final signatures. The timeline matters. Who knew what and when matters. Whether refusal was truly available matters. That shift should change behavior now, not after litigation. Smart productions treat consent integrity as evidentiary risk management. Every ambiguous choice today is potential discovery material later. Every undocumented change is a future credibility problem. Every retaliatory cast decision can become a pattern claim if repeated. Pattern claims are what institutions fear most, because patterns prove design failure, not isolated misunderstanding. Once a pattern is established, reputational recovery is expensive and incomplete. Insurance costs rise. Talent avoids projects. Distributors demand stronger assurances. Boards intervene. What looked like a creative shortcut becomes a governance crisis. Governance crises are preventable. The prevention toolkit is already known. Pre-briefed choreography, version control for scene terms, independent stop authority, strict closed set enforcement, real-time consent reconfirmation, and anti-retaliation enforcement with teeth. None of this reduces artistic ambition. It removes operational chaos that masquerades as ambition. At the human level, the goal is simpler. A performer should leave set feeling tired from work, not destabilized by uncertainty about what was allowed to happen. A crew should remember hard shooting days for complexity, not for silence around avoidable harm. A director should be judged by what they can achieve within boundaries, not by how far they can push people beyond them. That is mature craft. Constraint is not weakness in art. Constraint is where precision lives. Precision is what separates intensity from exploitation. Exploitation is what turns one person's fear into another person's prestige. Prestige without accountability is fragile. It can hold for years, sometimes decades, until records surface, testimony aligns, and context catches up. Then the same legacy once treated as untouchable is reread under a harder light. That rereading is already underway across film archives, classrooms, and labor contracts. It will continue because the underlying question is bigger than one title or one era. Who owns risk on set? Who controls meaning after release? Who pays when those two are misaligned? If those answers remain concentrated at the top, the industry repeats itself. If those answers are distributed through enforceable systems, the industry evolves. Evolution here is not abstract. It is measurable. Fewer incidents, clearer records, faster intervention, stronger trust, better performances, and fewer careers damaged in silence. That is the practical horizon, not a perfect cinema, a more accountable one. An accountable cinema also needs accountable memory. Memory is where harm is either buried or integrated. If archives preserve only the polished artifact and not the production context, future generations inherit technique without safeguards. They learn how the shot looked, not what it cost. Then the same mistake returns with new branding. Integrated memory works differently. It keeps the film in circulation, but attaches context that cannot be separated from it. Program notes, curriculum guides, retrospective panels, and critical editions should document both artistic influence and labor conditions, not to punish students or viewers, to prevent selective history, Selective history is operationally dangerous because it rewards outcome while erasing method. Method is where risk lives. If method disappears from memory, prevention disappears from practice. This is why institutions beyond studios matter. Film schools set professional norms before people enter sets. Festivals set prestige signals that shape industry behavior. Press outlets set language frames that either clarify or obscure power. Agencies set negotiation baselines that determine who gets protected. Unions set enforceable standards that turn values into obligations. If those institutions align, accountability scales. If they fragment, accountability becomes episodic and personality-driven. Personality-driven safety fails under pressure. Systems-driven safety survives turnover, hype cycles, and market shocks. Market shocks are coming faster now. Streaming economics compress schedules. International financing splits legal regimes. Social platforms accelerate reputational consequences. In that environment, the cost of weak consent systems rises, not falls. A production can lose value globally in days if process failures become visible. Visibility changes strategy. The old bet was delay and denial. The new reality is speed and receipts. Teams that cannot evidence process integrity are exposed quickly. Teams that can evidence it recover faster when disputes arise. Evidence integrity has a simple architecture: clear pre-production records, traceable change logs, independent witness channels, documented performer confirmations, and documented pause decisions. Without those, every controversy becomes a story war. With those, disputes can be resolved on facts. Facts reduce harm. They also reduce myth. Myth has long protected concentrated power in cinema. Genius, instinct, boldness, boundary breaking can all describe real artistic work. They can also be used to excuse unmanaged risk. The words are not the problem. The governance behind them is governance is what decides whether a hard day stays hard or becomes destructive. Destructive days rarely begin with obvious malice. They begin with small exceptions. Just this take, just this angle, just this change, just this once. Exception culture is the root problem. Every major breach is built from tolerated exceptions. So prevention is mostly the discipline to say no to exceptions when they touch consent. No hidden revisions. No surprise physical escalation. No private renegotiation without neutral oversight. No schedule argument that outranks safety. No retaliation after refusal. When those no rules hold, creative yes rules get stronger. Performers trust the room. Directors get better work. Crews operate with less moral friction. Editors inherit footage that is not ethically contaminated by avoidable coercion. That is the long-term competitive advantage, not only the moral advantage. Studios that build this reputation attract stronger talent. Projects with reliable safeguards close financing faster. Teams with clean process records face lower downstream disruption. Audiences increasingly reward work that can withstand context scrutiny. The industry does not need to choose between artistic intensity and worker dignity. That is a false binary inherited from weak management and protected myth. The real choice is between unmanaged power and disciplined collaboration. Unmanaged power produces occasional brilliance with repeated damage. Disciplined collaboration produces durable excellence with lower human cost. Over time, durable excellence wins. It ages better. It trains better. It scales better. And when history looks back, It does not have to split the frame between what was achieved and what was ignored. That is the target state, not innocence, not perfection. A profession where the strongest image in the film does not require the weakest person on set to carry the hidden injury. If cinema can hold that line under pressure, then progress is real. If it cannot, the old cycle returns on schedule. The difference is no longer knowledge. The difference is enforcement. Enforcement is where responsibility stops being language and becomes consequence. Consequences have to be predictable, fast, and visible inside the organization. If outcomes depend on who is famous, who is profitable, or who can control publicity, enforcement is cosmetic. Cosmetic enforcement trains people to wait out controversy rather than change behavior. Real enforcement has tiers. First tier is immediate operational response. Pause the scene, secure performer support, preserve records, and freeze further sensitive shooting until review is complete. Second tier is independent fact review, not by the same chain of command that approved the day's plan. Independent review limits conflict of interest and protects witnesses from subtle pressure. Third tier is corrective action, tied to role and decision authority. If someone altered sensitive terms without consent, penalties must reflect authority level, not just intent language. Senior status should increase accountability, not reduce it. Fourth tier is system correction. One incident should trigger policy patching, training updates, and audit expansion so the failure mode cannot repeat elsewhere. Without all four tiers, enforcement remains symbolic. Symbolic enforcement produces the same message every worker hears clearly. Results matter. Rules are negotiable. Negotiable rules are not rules. They are risks transferred downward. Downward transfer is the core structural problem in this history. People at the top keep optionality. People at the bottom absorb uncertainty. When uncertainty concerns intimate content, the cost is not abstract. It is personal, reputational, and often long-term. Long-term cost is why post-incident care matters too. If a performer reports boundary violation, support cannot end at legal intake. They need practical options, pause without penalty, role reassignment if requested, confidential counseling access, and documented protection from retaliation in casting and references. Retaliation is frequently informal, so protection must be formal. Track hiring decisions after reported incidents. Require justification trails for sudden role removals. Audit availability and fit explanations when patterns appear. Pattern detection is the only way to catch silent penalties. Silent penalties are how industries keep public policy while preserving private deterrence. Private deterrence is simple. Make one example, and others stay quiet. Breaking that mechanism requires collective visibility. If one performer speaks and 10 peers confirm process patterns, the burden shifts from individual credibility to institutional accountability. That is why unions, guild channels, and protected group reporting are strategic, not optional. Strategic protection also includes contract design. Sensitive scene clauses should include specific action descriptions, prohibited changes without written reconfirmation, name stop authorities, mandatory neutral presence, and explicit non-retaliation terms with dispute pathways. Generic mutual professionalism language is not enough. Specific language prevents reinterpretation under pressure. Pressure always returns. Budget overruns, weather delays, location limits, star schedules, release windows Under pressure, vague contracts collapse first. Specific contracts hold. Holding under pressure is the whole point. At the cultural level, leadership narratives must change too. Teams should stop praising how far a director pushed people and start praising how precisely a director achieved intensity within boundaries. Craft prestige needs to reward constraint management, not boundary erosion. When reward logic changes, behavior follows. Behavior change at scale needs metrics: incident rate per production phase, average pause to resolution time, repeat offender flags, retaliation indicators, and compliance variance across budget tiers. If those metrics are not tracked, leadership cannot claim control. No control means no accountability. Accountability is what converts tragic precedent into professional standard. That is the only durable way to honor people who were harmed under earlier systems. Build systems that make repetition harder, reporting safer, and enforcement unavoidable. Unavoidable enforcement is the destination, not because every set will be conflict-free, because conflict without coercion is manageable. Coercion without consequence is institutional failure. The industry already knows this in legal terms, financial terms, and reputational terms. What remains is execution discipline. Execution discipline is not dramatic. It is repetitive. Brief, confirm, record, rehearse, check, pause, review, correct, repeat until it is normal. When that becomes normal, the strongest person in the room no longer decides where consent begins and ends. The process does. And when the process holds, cinema can keep its intensity without sacrificing the people who make it possible. What follows from that is practical leadership design. Every production should designate a single accountable owner for consent protocol integrity, separate from creative hierarchy, not a symbolic title. A decision owner with stop authority, documentation authority, and direct reporting access above the line producer level. Why separate? Because conflicts of interest are built into set dynamics. Creative leaders are evaluated on output. Safety owners must be evaluated on protocol integrity. One person cannot optimize both under pressure without bias entering the decision. Role separation reduces that bias. Then establish 3 mandatory gates before any intimate sequence. Gate 1, pre-brief gate. No scene proceeds unless all physical beats, camera coverage, garments, barriers, and fallback options are documented and acknowledged by performers. Gate 2, rehearsal gate. No scene proceeds unless choreography is executed once under intended set conditions with neutral oversight and explicit performer reconfirmation. Gate 3, take gate. No scene proceeds unless day of conditions match approved terms. If anything changes, even small, the process resets to gate 1 for the changed element. Gate discipline prevents drift, which is how most boundary failures begin. Drift starts with minor deviations that feel efficient in the moment and become major breaches in aggregate. To manage drift, require live change logging during sensitive setups, time-stamped entries, who requested change, what changed, who approved, who reconfirmed, no retroactive edits. If there is no log, there is no change. No log means no go. Next, design witness protection into workflow. Sensitive scene reporting should support named and anonymous channels, but both must route to independent review teams, not solely production leadership. Anonymous channels without follow-through are trust theater. Trust theater increases risk because it convinces workers help exists when it does not. Workers test systems quietly before they rely on them. If first use yields delay, leakage, or retaliation, reporting collapses across the whole project. That collapse is preventable through response time commitments, acknowledge within hours, triage within 1 day, interim protection within 1 day, review launch within 2 days. Speed matters because uncertainty is itself a pressure tool. Slow review benefits whoever already has power. Fast structured review stabilizes the room. Stability must include communication discipline. During active review, prohibit informal narrative shaping by senior talent or PR teams. Public statements should avoid claims about intent before fact review closes. Premature narrative control contaminates witness confidence and evidence quality. Evidence quality depends on chain of custody habits. Preserve call sheets, preserve version history of scene documents, preserve comms relevant to changes, preserve camera and monitor metadata when required by policy. No selective retention. Selective retention creates legal and ethical asymmetry. Asymmetry destroys credibility even when underlying facts are mixed. For post-incident repair, include mandatory debrief loops, performer debrief, department head debrief, protocol owner debrief, then a cross-project memo with anonymized lessons and concrete control updates. Lessons that stay local, repeat globally. Cross-project learning is how one incident becomes system improvement rather than folklore. Folklore is unreliable. Systems are auditable. Auditability is the backbone of credible reform. External audits at random intervals should test not only paperwork completeness, but behavioral compliance under schedule pressure. Simulated pressure drills can expose whether crews actually honor stop calls when time and money are tight. If drills fail, retrain before next sensitive shoot block. Retraining should be role-specific. Directors, consent governance under creative stress. AD teams, stop call protocol execution. Producers, conflict escalation without retaliation. Talent reps, boundary negotiation and documentation review. Generic training videos do not change behavior in high-pressure moments. Role-specific repetition does. Finally, align incentives. If production bonuses ignore consent compliance, protocol erosion is predictable. Tie a portion of leadership compensation to verified safety and consent metrics. People protect what compensation rewards. Compensation alignment makes policy real. Without it, policy remains aspiration. With it, protocol becomes habit. Habit is what protects workers when memory fades and headlines move on. Because headlines always move on. The person on set still has to work tomorrow. Design the system for tomorrow, not for press response. That is the operational definition of respect in this industry. Not tribute speeches, not retrospective regret, not better slogans. Clear authority, hard gates, live logs, protected reporting, fast review, real consequences, and incentives that reward compliance under pressure. If those pieces hold, the room changes. And when the room changes, the story no longer has to begin with a person losing agency so someone else can claim realism. From there, the next frontier is interoperability. Film production is now distributed across countries, unions, vendors, and legal regimes. A project can prep in one market, shoot in another, post in a third, and distribute globally within weeks. If consent safeguards do not travel with the production, protections collapse at borders. Border collapse is common. teams assume local custom can override protocol. Vendors inherit sensitive work without full context. Contract language gets translated loosely. Accountability fragments, and no one owns the gap. To prevent that, productions need a portable consent standard pack. One core protocol set that follows the project everywhere, then local add-ons for stricter requirements. Never the reverse. Core pack should include uniform definitions of intimate content and boundary changes, minimum documentation requirements, non-negotiable stop authority rules, cross-border reporting pathways, and data retention standards compatible with all operating jurisdictions. If local law is stricter, elevate. If local law is weaker, core standard still holds. That is how you avoid compliance shopping, where teams route high-risk scenes to low-friction environments. Compliance shopping saves time short-term and multiplies exposure long-term. Exposure now includes platform risk. Streamers, distributors, and insurers are increasingly sensitive to process integrity in sensitive scenes. A single verified protocol breach can trigger delivery delays, indemnity disputes, marketing disruption, and catalog reputational drag. Catalog drag is underestimated. Legacy titles are continuously recontextualized by new audiences. If a studio cannot evidence ethical process evolution, archive assets become liabilities in each new release cycle. So archive strategy needs updating too. Add provenance layers to internal rights systems. What protocol version governed the shoot? What exceptions were approved? What complaints were logged? What remedies were applied? Not for public spectacle, for institutional memory and defensible governance. Defensible governance also needs vendor controls. Third-party production services, casting agencies, and line producers should be certified against the same consent protocol baseline. Procurement should include compliance scoring, not only rate and availability. If procurement ignores safety maturity, risk is purchased at discount and paid later at premium. At the creator level, representation ecosystems must evolve. Agents and managers should treat consent clauses like compensation clauses, non-optional, negotiated early, and enforced actively. Young talent should not enter intimate work with weaker contractual architecture than they have for travel per diem. That mismatch is still common. Close it, and risk drops immediately. For independent cinema, budget pressure is real, but low budget is not a waiver for consent rigor. Scaled implementations exist. Shared certified coordinators across projects, templated protocol kits, remote oversight options, and pooled reporting infrastructure through guild-affiliated programs. Small budget explains constraints. It does not justify hidden changes. Hidden changes are the universal failure mode. Failure mode analysis should be part of green light review for any project containing intimate scenes. Ask up front, where could consent fail? Who could override protocol? What would delay look like? What backup coverage options exist if a scene is paused? Backup coverage matters because teams breach most when they believe there is no alternate path. If alternate shot plans are pre-built, pressure to force a take drops. Force pressure is a design problem before it is a behavior problem. Design for alternatives and behavior improves. Behavior improvement compounds when peers see enforcement is real. One transparent, fair consequence event can shift norms faster than a year of policy memos. People believe systems after they witness them working against power, not only against juniors. Against power enforcement is the credibility threshold. hit that threshold and reporting rises first. Then incident severity drops over time as prevention improves. Miss that threshold and reporting drops while harm persists unmeasured. Unmeasured harm is governance blindness. Blind governance produces repeat crises. Repeat crises erode talent trust, audience trust, and investor trust at once. That is why this is no longer a niche ethics conversation. It is enterprise risk management in creative industries. Enterprise discipline does not kill art. It protects the conditions art needs: stable teams, clear focus, lower fear, higher repeat collaboration, and fewer reputational detonations after release. The long arc is simple. Old model, charisma governs, records follow. Better model, protocol governs, creativity executes. In the better model, intensity is built, not extracted. Trust is designed, not assumed. Consent is maintained, not inferred. Legacy is earned, not defended. That is the operating future if the industry chooses execution over mythology. And execution is a daily choice, scene by scene, line by line, before the camera ever rolls. History remembers the frame. Accountability remembers the process. The future of cinema depends on both.